Well, the rand has dipped to its lowest levels, falling over 2% to breach the 18 rand mark to the US dollar. It's currently trading at 1801 rand against the dollar as the greenback continues to strengthen amid developments in the United States. The dollar firmed against a basket of currencies, including the rand, since Donald Trump's US election win last week. The developments have weighed on global markets, especially commodities, as investors await clarity on U.S. policy in the Trump administration on taxes and deregulation and the profitability of a Fed rate cut in December. Domestically, expectations remained that of an interest rate cut later on this month by the SA Reserve Bank. Well, to speak more on this, let's now welcome Goolam Ballim, Chief Economist at Standard Bank. Mr. Ballim, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
First of all, just how significant is this decline in comparison to the trends over the past few years?
Well, we certainly welcome the headline notion that unemployment declined. However, we'd like to see consistency. In other words, either it holds steady over the near term, which in its own right would be welcome, but this data can be volatile. So I think while we certainly cheer the direction from the second quarter to the third quarter, one would like to see further evidence of growth in employment and also a fall in unemployment.
Is this perhaps a decline, a temporary fluctuation, or does it maybe represent a longer-term trend in the South African labour market?
So to the extent that employment grew by almost 300,000 individuals is welcome. However, we also recognize that the bulk of that increase emanated from the informal sector. One would like to see the formal sector being the primary locomotive of economic growth. In a sense, it speaks to steadier, more sustained job creation. So to the extent that it is the informal sector that has been the dominant generator of jobs, certainly welcome, but less quality in the employment path.
And has the decline in unemployment been more pronounced in specific demographics, like the age groups, educational background, or even the different regions?
So regionally, Gauteng lags to the extent that, if anything, there has not been much decline in unemployment. However, we have, for example, seen more frothy growth in employment in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. They kind of lead the geographical distribution of job creation.
And how much of this decline can be attributed to an increase in labour force participation versus the actual job creation?
So it's a really good question. And it's normally the case, at least in recent quarters, that the swell in individuals joining the labour force, combined with the unemployed searching for new jobs or re-entering the field of pursuing work, tends to dwarf the number of new jobs. And this is kind of a structural shortcoming in South Africa. Put differently, we do create jobs, but we tend to create fewer jobs than the demand for employment. We will need to see higher levels of growth, much higher levels of growth, to materially dent or flip the equation, where we easily absorb new entrants as well as discouraged workers rejoining the pursuit of labour.
You know, Mr. Ballim, you and I know that in instances like this, government always takes the credit. But if it's the opposite effect, government always takes the blame. So let's talk about the role that government policies such as the employment tax incentive or even infrastructure development projects play in this decline.
Look, we are entering potentially a new age in South Africa where the chemistry between the private sector and the government is enhanced, and combined we're able to create a more fruitful and constructive investment climate. So one has to give the government credit to the extent that two significant vehicles, such as Operation Vulindlela and the work streams between the private sector and the government, are contributing materially to the improved prognosis, which is crowding in the private sector more generally. So I think you're right, politicians tend to be self-interested and opportunistic at times when there's favorable data.
Yes.
But that said, I think we have to look beyond early, easy wins for political capital. What we should be looking for is just continuing to solidify, consolidate the government of national unity, both in terms of the spirit of a multi-party government, but also in terms of action, where we continue to see constructive ministers doing constructive things that speaks to, as you suggested, improving the investment climate, with it construction and infrastructure build, which is ultimately healthy for long-term growth and employment creation over the years.
Right, right. And we know that, COVID-19 and economic recovery, always go hand in hand. And how has the economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the unemployment rate, especially in sectors that were heavily affected, like tourism and retail, perhaps?
You're perfectly judicious in asking that question, to the extent that there are still some sectors in the economy, for example, in the secondary sector, where the level of employment is still lower than it was, say, in the third quarter of 2019. So it speaks to, in many respects, an economy that is still dealing with the shadows of COVID-19, trying to overcome the scars of that era. Of course, not all sectors are below the pre-pandemic levels, but in the most part, South Africa is still in post-COVID healing mode. And I suspect it is in early 2025 when we will, for the most part, cast aside the yoke of COVID-19.
All right, Mr. Ballim, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for sharing your analysis with us.